Hello, and welcome to this video on Seashell from Instruo, an analog semi-modular standalone synth voice that's also a digital hybrid with added hardware DSP and impressive software integration for extended controls and class-compliant MIDI and audio signals. Here's some of what's to come in the video. This video is sponsored by Instruo. So Seashell, I think, is a serious leap forward for Instruo in that it brings together some of the best of their analog modular synth design, but then expands it with a wide range of digital control with a standalone app, but then impressively it can also work as an analog plugin. And by analog plugin, which is just a term I'm choosing to use here, I mean you can have it in your DAW project, set up and using the Seashell plugin. Down a single USB cable you can send MIDI to and from the device and send audio to and from the device. So Seashell is a class-compliant sound card that lets you monitor your computer's audio and DAW, as well as its own analog synth sound. I try not to be too gushy or inflated in positivity when making videos, but I think Seashell really is an impressive device with a huge range of applications. This video will be an introduction to Seashell, showing it in the first way that I used it, which was as a standalone module or full synth voice alongside Eurorack modular gear. Then we'll get into the software, what that is and how to use it and how it extends the functions. And we'll then end on some cherry-picked things, either standalone or with the app, that I think make it special. But first, let's overview the sounds and features and strap in, there's a lot to get through, so the timing is on screen to skip forward in the video if you wish. Starting around the back, we have a headphone output on a TRS mini jack with level control, and this is also a stereo line output, and it comes with a TRS mini jack to dual 1/4" adapter for easy integration with other gear. There's a TRS MIDI input and also an included adapter for DIN MIDI. There's an external CV input that's routable in software, a 5V power supply input, and there's an included power adapter. And there's USB-C plus an included USB-C to C cable that can power the device and send MIDI and audio in and out of the device. On the front, all the patch points are typical Eurorack modular levels, and we have a sort of best of Instruo analog semi-modular synth voice. I have MIDI plugged in, and we'll be playing it from a keyboard to highlight some of the sounds as we go through the features. There's an initialized state which you access by holding the outer 4 buttons until the Wavefolder slider blinks. And then signal flow, just really quickly, is 2 oscillators with a square wave or PWM wave from the bottom and a sine wave through the folder feeding the filter that then goes through an output VCA and some diffusion effects at the back. Starting with the oscillators, these are heavily inspired by the CSL, and if you say CSL right, you can see where the name Seashell came from. CSL, Seashell. We have our volt per octave input and a button to select where it routes, and when this is white, this routes to the top oscillator, when it's amber it routes to the bottom, and when it's both, which might be a bit harder to see in the video, it's routing to both. Both oscillators have a coarse and fine tune control, and you can set up some interesting behaviours like octave switching or even scale note switching in the software, which will change how these coarse tune controls work. More on that later. We have hardware normalized FM, where the bottom oscillator's sine wave normals to the FM input at the top there, and you have a switch for linear or exponential behaviour and a scale control, and then the bottom FM input normals from the top one's sine, again with linear or exponential behaviour on the switch, and you can scale that behaviour. Let's just hear some FM first. The sync button will hard sync the top oscillator from the bottom, and while it's a white LED, let's first hear this without. This will cycle between when it's white being the fundamental tuning that hard syncs the top, but it can sync to an octave lower. Just tune up a bit. Or 2 octaves lower. And I think that CSL inspired combination of the sync modes and the FM is really what sets this apart for a wider range of tones. Filter fully open, tiny bit of folding. There's a really complex range of sounds that with a sync are really musical, even though you've got some complex analog, circular kind of feedback FM going on. We then move on to the Wavefolder, which is fed from the top oscillator, and this has a manual level on the slider and a CV input there which is shared for both folder mount and filter cutoff modulation, and there's an amount of modulation for the folder. If I cycle through the source button, this will choose which combination of waveforms from the 2 oscillators, or just one of them from the oscillators, feeds through. Let's just listen to the folding, and we'll turn off sync and FM. And you turn off sync simply by just holding it. And there's an additional hardware normal where the bottom oscillator routes through to the bias of the folder. So if we're just listening to the top oscillator through the folder and filter, though the filter's fully open, cycling back through the oscillator sources and just going back to a default non-FM, non-synced routing here. Let's just listen to the filter, and I'm going to set up an arpeggiator. Really smooth. With some Q. The CV input here modulates the filter cutoff as well as the folder, as we've mentioned, and there's a dedicated amount for the modulation, and that CV input is normal to its envelope, and there's a trigger input or gate input, a manual button. It responds to MIDI as you'd expect via USB or TRS MIDI, and by default it's an attack and release envelope. In the software you can change this to be an ADSR or a cycling 2-stage envelope, and you can do this on the hardware too with button combos, but we'll leave this as an attack and release envelope for now. And you also get a direct envelope output to patch on Seashell or to other gear. Modulating both the fold and the filter from the same envelope works great. There's lots of plucky sounds or evolving tones. And you can use that filter with the envelope like a low-pass gate. And then there's this middle knob, which is a diffuser effect, and this came from Jason wanting to take the edge off of dry analog synth sounds with stereo imaging tricks, modulation effects and delay lines that emerge out into a reverberant space at more extreme settings. Instruo are calling this a diffusion effects process that's fitting to the core of synthesizing sounds, rather than something to think of as post-effects. Let's just make some sounds here and hear how it evolves across that knob turn. So it gets pretty reverberant, but notice from nothing, certainly in headphones, you hear it start to open in stereo. It's very subtle. And then you start to hear these modulation effects. And of course it's less subtle, there's this nice metallic roomy reverb at that full setting. And this diffusion is hardware DSP built into the Seashell, and it's present on the main output on the back. It's also worth noting there's a VCA that's only on the main output at the back, and with a button combo or a software control you can enable or disable this VCA. So that's it for the hardware features, but it would be silly not to mention the software at this stage. Plugging in the Seashell via USB allows you to connect to a standalone Seashell controller app, which offers two-way communication of Seashell's controls, digitally controlling the analog parts, and there's a huge range of extended functions and options, such as an additional LFO, a modulation matrix, options to set up transpositional behaviours, and we'll explore that software later in the video. It's finally worth noting all of the Seashell sounds that you hear in this video are totally dry from Seashell's output. No effects or processing will be added anywhere. Any effects that you hear are from the diffusion DSP that's built into Seashell's hardware. So without further ado, I did tell you the features won't be quite long. Let's dive into the video. Chapter 1. Standalone and modular synth use. So here I wanted to make a quick patch just to show the kind of modular integration. I'm coming out of the line output on the back, so we have this hardware DSP and this diffusion effect. But I'm sequencing from the modular system, and I'm creating some very modular mixed modulation to modulate both the folder and the filter. Now if I mute some of this modulation, I'm driving the volt per octave and the gate of the envelope here on Seashell from Next Tuesday, a pattern generator that I use a lot. The envelope comes out into the mixer, and the mixer comes back in to feed the CV input to modulate the folding and the filter. And this works really well, just as is. But I really like mixing modulation, so I'm taking an accent gate pattern out of my pattern generator here, triggering another shorter envelope, and then mixing both Seashell's envelope and my modular envelope. So we've got this dynamic two-stage envelope pattern where some notes will be duller, they won't fold and open the filter as much. And it just adds some dynamics and life. I then have two oct LFOs here, one slower than the other, and both together, and they just kind of butt against each other and interfere. And I also have some stepped random. So all this mixes together. Let's turn the actual output down here. Seashell's envelope, an accent envelope, two oct LFOs, and some stepped random. Turn down its effect on the folder, maybe up it on the filter. A very lively 5-way mixed modulation into Seashell. And one thing I like to do with a patch like this on Seashell, where we have this kind of folded top and PWM bottom, is to sync the oscillators. Add some FM on the top oscillator from the bottom. Bias that Wavefolder. This really growly, expressive, very West Coast type voice. All analog. Oh, it's such a grungy kind of face gurney bass sound. This is the Wavefolder as the top oscillator, PWM pulse as the bottom, and it's all the kind of default routings. And what I want to look at here is things like there's a gate to VCA function. We can't see the VCA on the panel, that's digitally implemented. And also to look at routing your sources through the filter and where your VOP per octave is going. Now the first thing we'll look at is the gate to VCA function. There is an inbuilt VCA, and it takes the gate that you patch in, or MIDI gate, and it just adds the release time, so it's not a hard on and off, but it doesn't take the onset of the attack into account. And you're hearing the effect of that here on the main output, which has the VCA on it. Now to turn that gate on and off, if you hold source and then hold, not tap because that changes some of the envelope settings, hold source and hold the button there for the envelope. If I open the filter now, this has removed the VCA from the signal path. And that can be quite handy if you just want this to drone, or if you say want to use the filter like a low pass gate, which is what I'll do here. Now I want to also change what waveforms are going into the filter here. I'll remove this diffusion for now. And we simply tap through the sources. Again, the software makes this really simple, but as you cycle through them, you have different combinations of either a folder or a saw on the top oscillator, or the PWM pulse or a saw on the bottom, or one of them individually, rather than both oscillators together. Now, this particular pattern here is 2 saw waves, which is what I want. And then you can choose on this button the VOP per octave where it routes. If it's a white LED, it's the top oscillator. If it's amber, it's the bottom. And the combination of both is both of them. So going to just white, this oscillator is now static. This one is being sequenced. If I go to amber, this one is being sequenced and this one isn't. And this can be quite handy when we start getting into some of the sync functions. If we sync the oscillators, and that will sync the top one from the bottom one. With some really great sounds. So here I wanted to build some just big Seashell drones, stay completely modular on the frontier, and it's the filter output that we're monitoring, it's the yellow trace, and that's coming through my modular mixing and recording system. Now the sound here, there's some folding, filtering, oscillators in sync and some FM. And it's already a really rich sound. But in a modular environment, curiosity often gets the better of me, and I wondered how fast we could trigger the envelope. So I have an oscillator here, this AGH mini-mod oscillator. It's this green trace, a square wave, and just patching this in is going to modulate the folding and the filter. You can trigger it at audio rates. And it does that nice thing that lots of function generators do, where it won't resetting its rising state. So you can divide down this incoming trigger, or rather this incoming square wave oscillator. And that allows you, the blue trace there is the envelope by the way, that allows you to say, drop an octave. It's going to lock an octave lower than the triggering. And just the effect this has, the audio rate envelope modulating forward, and filter. I can hear step behavior going on. It's such an interesting evolving sound. Now this of course got me thinking, can I make this track somehow and just patch in a keyboard? We'll first patch this to the Vault Proctive on Seashell. And as I play my keyboard, it's of course just mess because this has been tuned with this oscillator. I fine-tuned that to be in with the tuning of the Seashell. So I'll also take a cable and modulate the Vault Proctive on the oscillator that's triggering the envelope. And now as I play a keyboard, it's such a rich sound. Let's just divide this down again. Big reverb back in. Chapter 2. Extended Software Functions. So here's Seashell with its accompanying software. There's a Seashell controller, which is on screen now, and this will work with MIDI communication back and forth, and it will do audio back and forth, and power. This single USB cable out of my laptop is powering MIDI and audio in both directions. I'm monitoring the main out and recording it just in terms of how I make a video. But this could be your main headphone out, like a sound card for your computer, or feed your speakers, whatever you want really. Now as I move things on the controller, you'll see them move, things like tunings. We can see the button being pressed. Folder mounts. But you'll notice straight away there's lots of additional settings here and visualizations for things like button combos, say the gate to VCA, which was holding source and holding the envelope button. You can simply just cycle that on and off here. And things like the source that feeds the filter, you can cycle through them and see on screen which combination of waveforms, whether it's just one of them from one oscillator or both and which mixture of. It's really handy just to be able to visualize that. Lots of additional settings that you should go watch the Instruo video manual for. I'm not going to go through all of them here. I just wanted to show that this exists, and we'll move across into a DAW and show how you can use this like an analog plugin. So here we are in Ableton Live, the same setup going on, and there's a VST version of the Seashell controller, and we're going to use this just like an analog plugin, one that has MIDI controller-esque controls both ways with the app, but also audio both ways, and we're going to monitor our Ableton output through here too. So if I go into Ableton's settings, we have MIDI in and out, but we also have class compliant audio in and out. And one thing to note, and I'm just going to start playing here, let's even just start the click and a drum beat. If we go into the Seashell controller and go into the settings, we have a monitor mix that is the synth Seashell all the way to the right, and not Seashell, it's not doing anything here, to the left, so you can blend Seashell sound with whatever else you're doing. Handy if you want to monitor through it, feed your speakers, use it as a traditional sound card even. I'll stick to just monitoring Seashell, removing the click and that drum beat for now. And you can see that when I start playing Seashell, we can select external inputs, we can monitor them coming in. But the kind of pro move here that I really like, which is something Jason mentioned to me, and it's a great idea, is to use the external audio instrument. You could use this to send in and out, analog to other gear. So I've selected on the inputs 1 and 2 with Seashell. I have the monitor controller here, so I can feed Seashell by the keyboard, and it all just happens as if this is a MIDI instrument, but it's not. I'm calling it an analog plugin. So this got me thinking, With all this just over a USB cable, I could take this out, laptop and Seashell, out somewhere nice. So let's take Seashell on a little adventure. Feeling an urge to make music outside, I asked the OG Div baby if she fancied helping me make some music outside, to which she said yes, so we headed out on a little adventure with my laptop and Seashell. That one? So that was incredibly fun. Seashell and a laptop, making music in the sun. And for anyone curious, this is Baildon Moor, which is a lovely space. Now hitting extend here on the controller or the plugin version in your DAW, there's a whole extended set of controls. And this has a whole matrix and an LFO that vastly expands what Seashell is. It's a whole software platform controlling analog synthesis and some analog DSP with the diffusion as well. And it's worth noting that the diffuser knob becomes a macro. You can see it down the bottom left of that matrix to scale the whole matrix of modulation that you set up. So let's just set up a sound here so I can show you how that works. And going into the matrix, you simply click a source, let's say an offset, and let's have that move, say filter frequency, wavefolder amount, and you click and drag up and down for a bipolar amount of modulation. So this knob, and you'll see it move again, bottom left of the matrix. Let's include the LFO that's in that extended version. So I'll set that as a triangle LFO as a source. Let's have that move the filter folder maybe in the opposite direction, and I'm actually going to move, let's say, the LFO's rate down as I turn up that offset. So we've now got this macro control that is turning up the filter and the fold. It's turning up a depth of triangle LFO to the filter and the fold, and also turning down the rate of the LFO. So here's a really fun patch where I've turned off the gate to VCA, so you could just have this drone. And I've built up a matrix using the LFO as the kind of driver here. I'll turn up the macro knob on the hardware. Where we build up quantized pitch motion, big diffusion, sucking, modulating filter. You can envelope those LFO rates, cut out the diffusion, which I kind of am never tiring of. So it kind of sucks it back down to mono and blooms back out to stereo again. So going through what's going on, this is the sawtooth from the LFO. The LFO is set to be unipolar, so it only goes up from 0 rather than back down again. That routes to the volt per octave routing for transpose, and I'll come to that in the next patch, but you actually have a whole transposition engine up next to the oscillators as well as the volt per octave. So it's the LFO there that's actually doing the transposition, and it's transposing by notes that we set on this little keyboard. The LFO sawtooth is also reducing the filter frequency. I have an offset, which the macro generates. And that offset's upping the rate of the LFO, just a tiny amount. It's bringing up the filter frequency, and it's bringing up the diffusion amount. There's then an envelope, and that envelope also controls the LFO rate, which you heard there. With that instant pushing up. That instant pushing up of the rate, and then the gate and trigger button for the envelope itself is also a source, and it routes to the filter frequency, so when I push the button, it pushes that filter up. And it reduces the diffusion amount. So one more time, let me slowly bring this up. We can still send MIDI in, so if I set that at a point where it's arpeggiating itself. Chapter 3. Things that make Seashell special. So in that previous patch of kind of nutty arcade trills, we heard quantized pitch motion from the LFOs. And let's explore that transposition a little bit clearer here. I have the gate to VCA off, so this can just drone, very basic sound. And let's go to the matrix, pick, say the random wave from the LFO. I've already turned the matrix knob all the way up full. We'll set the destination to be frequency first, and turn up an amount. And as you'd expect, random LFO, random pitches. But if we change this to be volt per octave transpose, it goes through this quantization. And you can select different notes, let's say do a whole major scale. You get the idea, so you could play around by, say, picking out chord tones. And that's just octaves there. But one thing that's really interesting, and I'm just going to reset the matrix there, you can actually turn on the transpose for the coarse tune knobs. If we turn on transposition for that oscillator's coarse tune, the pot is still smooth, but we've created these detents, these values, which is great, having a fine tune and an octave. That's a very common thing on a lot of synths. But you could say work in octaves and fifths. You could say do a minor 7 chord. And this gets really interesting where, say, let's turn on the saw wave for the bottom oscillator. You want to sync them. Use the bottom one as your main tuning. Without transposition, say. But then have stepped motion on the other oscillator. Or vice versa, you want the bottom one to follow a transposition pattern, but you want free rein for sweeping sync tones. And one last thing in transposition, because this would just save to the hardware, you could actually set this up to have an input. There's a CV input on the back of the unit there. You could patch that in to the matrix. CV input is a source. You could turn up an amount, plug in, say, an external sequencer, and then send that to the transposition. So it would have a built-in kind of standalone quantizer that you could plug into the back, send any analog sequencer in, theremin controller type voltage source, and have quantized behavior without having to have a volt per octave source to patch into the front. So here's a really cool thing that's built into Seashell, which is that the second oscillator normals through to the bias of the Wavefolder. To demonstrate this, I have an arpeggio playing. I'm playing the keyboard off screen, so I might change the pitch every now and then. As I did just then, and I'm using the gate from that arpeggio to create this stepped random sequence that modulates the folder mount, the filter's wide open, and we're just enveloping the VCA. I've cycled through the sources here on the button, so we're just listening to the top oscillator, so it's just this oscillator through that folding. Now if I turn up the bias, you can hear the influence of this oscillator. What I'd like to do, just to get a clearer picture of what that's doing, is change the volt per octave so this isn't tracking anymore. So just the white LED there, just the volt per octave controls the top one. This one will now be static. And all these glorious formant-like sounds, digital FM-like sounds are in there kind of ready and waiting. If we turn on the LF, low frequency mode, this will almost be like a PWM of the fold. If I come back up to audio modes, get volt per octave back to the top oscillator. Stepped random back to the fold. You may notice the sound always somewhat feels animated, and there's built-in animation here. This is without. Just turn that sustain up. Just a static sound. But with it, there's a fixed frequency LFO that will modulate pulse width and the folder, just to keep things rich and moving. And I didn't realise this at first. I thought this was a really rich sound on its own. I played with it without the software to start with. But I wondered why it was so kind of rich and lush, and it's this modulated PWM and folding that you can scale in the software. With Seashell powering via USB, I wanted to try it with a power bank in a kind of portable, in this case outdoor setting. Brought along a Fits, which is a mono Norns clone for sequencing, a USB power bank, and grabbed my Zoom recorder. This is the script Awake on Fits, and it's two sequencing lanes where the bottom one transposes the top, and in this case outputs MIDI to Seashell. Note probability and different sequencer step lengths keep things evolving nicely here. Stereo line out of Seashell was recorded into the Zoom recorder where I was monitoring on headphones. And I reckon Seashell and the Fairy Garden could become good friends for some magical outdoor synthesizing. Magical fairy joking aside, I do think a power bank and a small sequencer style device is a great way to explore Seashell portably. So the Seashell has a kind of circular complex FM routing that's inspired by and comes from Instruo's CSL, complex Eurorack oscillator. Let's explore that here and get a little bit weird and abstract. but then we'll pull it into something musical that tracks as well. First, we're coming out of the main output here. Let's turn off the VCA, holding source and the envelope button. We're just listening to the top oscillator. I've cycled through those sources so we can't hear the bottom one. And let's actually cycle through so it's not a saw wave and it's just the Wavefolder. So there we have just the folder output. And we're not hearing the second oscillator. Now the FM is patchable, but it's already normaled here. So let's just tune down slightly. Turn on, say, linear FM, and turn up the influence of the bottom oscillator. And you can tune in these softer, lush, linear analog FM tones. They fold really nicely as well. And then that influence of this oscillator on the bias works really well. And then the second oscillator similarly is normaled. We could linear FM modulate the second oscillator from the top one. And now we have this circle top oscillator that we're monitoring, linear FM modulated from the bottom one from the top, which is modulated from the bottom, circular feedback of FM. Now if we want to go a little more extreme, other than less musical, clangorous tunings there, you could go exponential. Let's remove the bottom FM. Let's add in the FM again, exponential on the bottom. Like a weirdly sputtering electronic engine or something. We could also take, say, the triangle out here from the bottom and modulate the folding. Which can be quite fun. And if this isn't for you, this is a bit too abstract. You're only ever really a sync away from locking into something musical. So even without the fold mod, this is really extreme circular feedback, exponential analog FM. It's a really fun way to explore analog FM, and as it's now in sync, we could patch the volt per octave signal in. You get musical, pitch tracked but very complex analog circular FM tones. Modulating the fold. If you've got this far in the video, drop a shell sync down in the comments. What do you think? I'd love to know, so again, leave a comment. Thanks for watching. You can support me on patreon.com/DivKid to gain access to many exclusives and the DivKid Discord community. I'm sure we'll see a lot more from Seashell, but I'll say thanks for now, and I'll see you next time. Bye!